They didn't even try to hide it. The laughter came out fast, careless, like it didn't matter who heard it or how it landed. He stood there just a few steps inside the room, not saying a word, not reacting, not moving. For a second, it almost looked like he didn't understand what was happening. But that wasn't it. He understood perfectly. The way people looked at him. The quick glances. The smirks. The low voices that weren't low enough. It wasn't new. It was familiar. The kind of moment where people decide who you are before you ever speak. Someone said something louder this time. The kind of comment meant to get a reaction. Few others laughed harder, feeding off it. Still, nothing from him. No anger, no argument, no attempt to defend himself. Just silence. And that silence only made it worse. Because when someone doesn't react, people assume they can keep going. Push. A little more. Say a little more, so they did. The room wasn't crowded, but it felt loud, not because of noise, because of energy. Everyone had already picked a side without even realizing it, and he was alone on the other one. But there was something off, something no one paid attention to in that moment. He wasn't shrinking. He wasn't uncomfortable. If anything. He looked like he was waiting. Not for them, for something else. The door behind them made a quiet sound, so soft it barely registered. No one turned. No one cared. The laughter kept going, another comment, another round of smirks. But then, something shifted, not in what people were saying, in how it felt. Like the room suddenly lost its balance. One person paused mid-sentence. Another stopped smiling without knowing why. It was subtle, but it spread, because someone had walked in, calm, silent, unnoticed, at first, and in that exact moment. The situation that looked so simple just seconds ago was about to change completely. It was supposed to be a normal evening, nothing intense, nothing worth remembering, just a private gathering where people came to talk, relax, and be seen. The kind of place where confidence fills the room before conversations even begin. Groups had already formed, some standing close, others sitting back, watching. Voices overlapped. Opinions came quickly. And in spaces like that, people don't take long to decide who belongs and who doesn't. He had arrived quietly, no introduction, no attention drawn to him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, didn't dress to stand out, didn't carry himself like he needed approval either, but that didn't stop the room from reacting. At first, it was just looks, quick, almost automatic. Then came the assumptions, not spoken directly but clearly understood. He didn't match the energy, didn't match the confidence others were projecting, and in places where image matters more than truth. That's enough for people to make up their minds. So they did. A few started whispering, not quietly enough to hide it, just enough to pretend they weren't doing it. Others joined in slowly. It wasn't organized. It never is. That's what makes it feel normal. Someone made a passing comment. Another person added something on top of it. Then came the laughter. Not directed at him openly. But not far from it either. The kind of laughter that sits just close enough to be heard, close enough to send a message. And the message was simple. He didn't belong here. Still, he didn't respond. He didn't try to correct anyone. Didn't step forward, didn't step back. He just stayed where he was. Observing. There was no rush in him. No need to prove anything in that moment. And that's what people misunderstood the most. Because in a room where everyone is trying to show something, the one person who isn't becomes the easiest target. Time passed, but the tone didn't change. If anything, it settled into something more comfortable for them, more confident. They weren't testing anymore. They had already decided. And once people feel certain about their judgment, They stop questioning it. That's when the behavior becomes natural, effortless, unfiltered, and that's exactly what was happening now. The room moved on, but not really. Because even as conversations shifted, attention kept circling back to him, like he had become part of the background, but still the focus at the same time, and through all of it, he stayed the same. No reaction, no change, just that same quiet presence. And somehow, that silence was starting to stand out more than anything else in the room. There's a certain weight in the air when people underestimate someone, not loud, not obvious, but subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. He felt it, even before the laughter began, even before the whispers. It's the kind of energy that tells you, you are not part of this, you are outside, you don't belong here. He didn't flinch, didn't tighten his fists, didn't take a step back. He simply stood, and that made them laugh even harder. Because when someone doesn't react, people assume weakness. They assume fear. They assume the game has already been won. But he wasn't weak. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting silently, calmly, watching them carefully, studying how quickly they reveal themselves. How easy it is for confidence to turn into arrogance. How quickly laughter can shift from joy to discomfort. And that silence, that stillness, it created a kind of imbalance. The people in the room didn't notice at first. They were too busy thinking they were in control, too busy enjoying the temporary power of ridicule. One by one, their small gestures started to tell another story. Smile that faltered, a joke that didn't land, eyes that darted to the door for reasons they didn't understand. He stayed still, quiet, measured, and yet every movement he made was deliberate. Every blink, every slight shift in stance. A signal they weren't noticing, but the tension was building anyway. Because tension doesn't always come from what someone says. Sometimes it comes from what someone doesn't say. Sometimes it comes from restraint, patience, and calm focus. The laughter began to feel uneven, a little too loud, a little too forced. Their energy started clashing. Their certainty started to crack. The more they tried to maintain dominance, the more uncomfortable it became. And that discomfort spread slowly, quietly until it filled the space. He didn't smile. He didn't move closer. He didn't confront them. He simply existed in the room on his own terms. And that simple fact was disarming. They had expected a reaction. They had expected a fight. They had expected tension to escalate in obvious ways. But nothing happened. That's when imbalance became noticeable. The power they assumed they had, it was gone. Without a word, without action, without confrontation. The dynamic had shifted. He didn't have to prove anything. He didn't have to fight back. He just needed to remain steady. And yet, inside, the room felt the change. The confident laughter of before now carried doubt. The smirks no longer reached. The eyes, the subtle shifts in posture betrayed a growing unease. He was calm, controlled, silent, and that silence was louder than anything they could have said. Because true presence isn't measured by volume, it's measured by effect. And the effect was undeniable. Have you ever been in a room where silence spoke louder than words? For the first time they began to question themselves. Their certainty wavered. The energy in the room grew uneven. What they thought they understood about the situation was no longer certain, and that quiet patience, that controlled calm, was starting to win, even though nothing had changed outwardly, because the real shift wasn't in the room. It was in perception, in understanding, in the recognition that assumptions can be wrong, and that recognition would change everything that was about to happen next. The comments kept coming, small, casual, almost harmless, if you ignored the tone. Each word was a tiny push, a test, a measurement of boundaries. First, it was the glances, quick sideways looks that lingered for just a moment too long. Then came the whispers, quiet enough to seem like nothing, loud enough to reach anyone listening carefully. A pattern started to form. They didn't need to coordinate. No one said, "Let's laugh at him together." It happened naturally, like water finding its path. One action led to another, one comment encouraged the next. He noticed, of course, but he didn't act. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. And that made it worse for them, because people expect a response, a flinch, a retort, anything that confirms their assumptions. When it didn't come, their energy began to shift. They laughed louder, tried harder, leaned in closer. And still, nothing. They were confident at first, certain, sure of the rhythm they had created. But the rhythm was fragile. Every attempt to provoke him only revealed more about them than about him. Every glance, every chuckle, every joke was part of a silent pattern, one that he recognized immediately. They didn't see it. They thought he was just quiet. They assumed patience meant submission. They assumed calm meant weakness. But patience isn't weakness. Calm isn't vulnerability. The energy in the room began to feel uneven. Subtle tension crept in, like the air before a storm. People stopped laughing in unison. Some hesitated mid-sentence. Others tried to cover their pause with another laugh. The room was still loud, still full of voices, but the pattern they relied on was starting to unravel. He observed them closely. Every tilt of the head, every nervous glance, every forced smile. Small movements became meaningful. A gesture here, a breath there, tiny cracks forming in the facade of confidence. It wasn't obvious. Not to everyone. But it was real. The ones who had assumed dominance over him now felt it slipping away. Not because he had said anything, not because he had acted. Simply because he existed calmly, steadily, without reaction. And that created anticipation. A silent, almost invisible tension that made the room hold its breath. A feeling that something was about to happen, even if no one knew what. They had built their pattern carefully. He had broken it effortlessly. And now, the laughter that once defined the room felt off, uncertain, wavering. The next move would decide everything. He remained still observing, still measured. The room's pattern had reached a breaking point, and the change in energy wasn't coming from him, actively. It was coming from them. Every laugh, every comment, every glance had set the stage, and now, the stage was ready for what was about to arrive. Then something changed, not with words, not with motion, not with anything obvious. The room didn't erupt. No one slammed a door. No one tripped or shouted. It was quieter than before, but not silent. It was the kind of shift you feel in the pit of your stomach. A tension that creeps in, slow and deliberate, without warning. The laughter that had once been confident now faltered. A chuckle here, a smirk there, started to feel strained. The jokes that had landed perfectly before suddenly didn't hit the same. No one noticed it at first. They were too busy enjoying their own supposed dominance, too busy telling themselves the story they wanted to believe. But it was happening. The energy in the room had subtly tilted, like a table balanced perfectly on one leg, now slightly off-center. The balance was fragile, and it didn't take much to feel it. He remained still, quiet, measured, not because he was afraid, not because he was unsure, because he knew the room was changing, slowly, imperceptibly, and the timing was theirs to misread. They began to shift unconsciously. A foot tapped. A hand fidgeted. A glance darted toward the door. It was subtle, almost invisible, but perceptible to anyone who was paying attention. Confidence that had seemed so natural moments ago began to falter. The laughs that had rolled easily off tongues now carried hesitation. Voices tried to fill the gaps, but the energy didn't respond. The rhythm was gone. Even those who had laughed the hardest were affected. Not consciously, but instinctively. They had assumed control of the room. They had expected him to falter, to react, to become uncomfortable, but he didn't. And that lack of reaction, that steady, calm presence, was changing everything. The change was invisible to most. But for those paying attention, it was undeniable. A subtle reversal of power, an unseen shift in dynamics. No one could explain why they felt the pause, why the room suddenly seemed heavier, why their laughter no longer carried the confidence it once had. He hadn't acted, he hadn't spoken, he hadn't even moved. Yet everything felt different, because the balance had shifted quietly, internally. Their perception of control was fractured, their certainty of dominance slowly slipping. It was the moment before a storm, not a violent one, not loud, but a storm that could not be ignored. Eyes that had avoided him now flicked toward him unconsciously. Gestures became smaller, more hesitant. Breaths slowed. Movements became calculated. He was aware of it all. Not with alarm, not with satisfaction, simply with observation. The room had begun to recognize, without words, that they had underestimated him. Not everyone could see, and not everyone could name it, but the shift was real, undeniable, and it would grow. Step by step, moment by moment. Until the next arrival changed the situation entirely. The shift wasn't immediate, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to be noticed outright. It was internal, psychological. Subtle enough to feel unsettling, but not overt enough to call attention to it. And in that unseen change, the room was no longer the same. The balance had shifted. The stage was ready. Something was coming. Something that would make them remember this moment for far longer than they expected. The unseen change was complete. And all that remained was waiting. The door had already opened. A subtle creak, almost unnoticed, like it was just another sound in the room. No one turned. No one acknowledged it. But the air shifted instantly, not loudly, not with fanfare, just a presence, a calm authority that couldn't be ignored. He stepped in, quiet, measured, certain. No announcement, no words to claim attention. Yet every eye in the room found him. The ones who had laughed moments ago felt it first, a prickle along the back of the neck, a sudden awareness that they were being watched. In a way they weren't prepared for. He moved slowly without urgency, scanning the room just once, not searching, observing, measuring, not judging, not provoking, simply there. The laughter stopped, almost instantly. The energy shifted from careless confidence to hesitant awareness. The same people who had felt in control seconds ago now felt small, but not powerless. Just aware that they had misread the situation, misread him. The presence wasn't loud, and it wasn't aggressive. It was the kind of presence that makes people rethink every assumption they've ever made about a room. No one dared speak. No one dared move first. The tension was not explosive, but palpable, like electricity hanging in the air. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to confront anyone. His stillness was enough. Every eye followed his movements. Every head turned slightly toward him, unconsciously. Every joke that had just landed so easily suddenly fell flat. The calm in his posture contrasted sharply with the unsettled energy around him. It was a study in contrast, quiet authority against chaotic assumption. And then he walked toward the center of the room, not threatening, not aggressive, purposeful, deliberate. The room became aware of itself in a way it hadn't before. The jokes, the smirks, the laughter they now felt inappropriate, even meaningless, even embarrassing. The quietest people in the room noticed first. Then, the louder ones. The ones who had assumed dominance over him began to shift. They straightened slightly, adjusted posture, tried to regain composure. But the energy had already changed. Their confidence had cracked. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look directly at those who had mocked him. Instead, he glanced past them, eyes steady, expression neutral, presence enough. And the room began to realize they were no longer in control. He was. The moment didn't need noise, or confrontation, or drama. It existed in perception. In the subtle recognition that someone else's presence could change everything. All at once, the laughter from before seemed distant. The jokes that had flowed naturally now felt forced. Every movement, every glance, every gesture from the group carried hesitation. And yet he didn't push it further. He didn't escalate. He simply existed in that space. Calm, collected, unshaken. The ones who had laughed at him were left to process their own reactions, to face the fact that their assumptions had been wrong, and the one who had been underestimated finally had the room in balance again, not with aggression, not with words, but with presence. The turning point had arrived. The room had shifted completely, and no one could deny it. Every laugh had faded, every smirk had lost confidence, every glance held uncertainty. The quiet authority that had entered was more powerful than any words, more impactful than any argument, and the room understood it, whether they wanted to or not. The stage was set, and from this moment forward, nothing would feel the same. The room had changed, though no one admitted it out loud. The confidence that once filled every corner had dimmed. The people who had laughed freely were now measuring every word, every gesture. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aggressively. He simply existed in the space, calm, controlled, steady, and that was enough to flip the perspective entirely. The ones who had assumed dominance realized. They had misread him. Every laugh, every smirk, every whispered comment suddenly felt hollow. They understood quietly that the balance of power was no longer what they thought it was. It wasn't just about authority. It was about presence, about recognition, about awareness. They had underestimated him, not in terms of skill or strength or ability, but in terms of influence, in terms of how much a composed, unreactive person could shift the energy of an entire room. He didn't need to act. He didn't need to prove anything. Every pause, every glance, every slow, deliberate movement told the story for him. The room felt it. The laughter had died down completely. The smirks faded. The confidence that had been loud and careless moments before now hesitated. Even the people who hadn't spoken much before now noticed the shift. Even they could feel it. The turning point was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. It didn't require loud gestures or dramatic confrontation. The reversal happened quietly, psychologically, through the awareness of presence. The ones who had laughed began to replay their own words in their minds. What they said, how they said it, and most importantly, how they had assumed the situation was under their control. That assumption had crumbled. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The room had already admitted it on its own. The perspective reversal wasn't about proving superiority. It was about showing how misjudgment can shift dynamics in an instant. It was about the quiet authority of someone who refuses to react out of fear, anger, or pride. And in that moment, the room had no choice but to see clearly what they had ignored before. What would you have done if you were in that room at that exact moment? Eyes that had once mocked now flickered with uncertainty. Gestures that had been confident now slowed. Even the energy of the room itself seemed to pause, acknowledging the shift. He remained calm, silent, observant. Not because he needed to dominate, but because he understood the effect of presence better than anyone else there. And the ones who had laughed the loudest were forced to reconsider. Not just him, but their own behavior, their own assumptions, their own understanding of control. The room had changed, irreversibly, and the person they had laughed at was now the one quietly holding the balance. The shift was complete, and nothing would feel the same again. No one spoke first. The room held its breath. The energy had shifted so subtly, so completely, that words felt heavy. The confidence that had dominated seconds ago was gone. The smirks, the chuckles, the whispers, all had faded into quiet hesitation. Even the ones who had thought themselves cleverest now felt the weight of their own assumptions. He remained still, calm, measured, not aggressive, not confrontational, simply present. And that presence was louder than anything anyone could have said. The realization came slowly, first as a pause in movement, a glance caught mid-shift, a smile that faltered, then as a quiet, undeniable understanding. They had misjudged him. The people who had laughed at him felt it internally, not humiliated, not openly scared, just aware. Aware that their certainty, their dominance, their casual dismissal had been wrong. The balance of the room had shifted, without violence, without a word, just through observation, through calm authority, through quiet confidence. The laughter they had relied on to reinforce control now echoed faintly in their minds, sounding hollow and meaningless. Every gesture they had made to assert power now felt awkward. Every whispered comment, every glance at him, they replayed in their thoughts like a recording they wished they could pause. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't acknowledged their attempts. And yet the room had changed completely. The silence itself had become a message. The quiet had authority. The pause had weight. Even those who had not participated in mocking him now sensed it. The energy around them had shifted. The room was no longer unified in confidence. It was uncertain, hesitant, a little raw. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to prove a point. The recognition of him, the acknowledgement of his presence, had done all the work. The people who had underestimated him now experienced the subtle, unsettling realization of their miscalculation. Their internal narrative had changed. They were forced to confront that. Dominance and confidence aren't always loud, and that quiet, steady authority can hold a room without ever raising a hand or a voice. For the first time, their attention wasn't on jokes or mockery, it was on him and on their own assumptions. The room had transformed from a space of careless judgment to a space of awareness. The energy that had been taken for granted was now fragile. The previous pattern of laughter and dismissal was gone. And the one they had laughed at? He remained unchanged, silent, still, steady. And in that stillness he had become the measure by which the entire room now defined itself. The realization was quiet but complete. It didn't need words. It didn't need confrontation. It was internal, psychological, undeniable. The shift was irreversible. The power of calm presence had replaced chaos, and everyone in the room now understood it, whether they wanted to or not. Moments like this don't need noise. They don't need confrontation. Or raised voices sometimes. The impact is quiet, almost invisible. The room had shifted completely, not through argument or aggression, but through presence. Every glance, every gesture, every silent acknowledgement carried more weight than any spoken word. The ones who had laughed earlier now understood something they hadn't before. They realized that assumptions can be wrong, that confidence doesn't always come in the form of volume or motion. That presence, calm and steady, can command more authority than any display of force. He hadn't needed to fight, hadn't needed to prove anything. And yet, the room had recognized him as someone not to be dismissed. It was a lesson in perception, a lesson in patience, a lesson in how power and respect can shift in subtle ways. The people who had underestimated him carried a quiet awareness now. Their laughter was gone. Their smirks had faded. and even the energy they had relied on to dominate the room no longer existed. All because of calm, measured presence, because of patience, because of self-control. He remained, unchanged, silent, and steady. And in that stillness, he taught a simple truth. Respect doesn't require noise. Influence doesn't require aggression. And judgment made too quickly can always be revealed as wrong. The room had learned something about perception, about assumptions, about understanding before dismissing. Sometimes, the strongest impact doesn't come from action. It comes from showing up the right way. Calm, present, unshaken. And the ones who laughed learned that lesson without a single confrontation. The room didn't need chaos to understand the truth. It only needed presence and awareness. Do you think people judge too quickly based on appearances alone? The quiet power of that moment lingered. It left a mark not on bodies but on perception, not on voices but on understanding. And sometimes that is more important, more lasting, more real. The resolution wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was internal, psychological, complete. Respect, influence, and understanding had shifted quietly, and nothing in that room would ever feel the same again.